Hi, thanks for tuning into Street Life. I'm Natasha and I'm back at it with a recipe for jerk pork. I know a lot of you by now might have tried jerk chicken, but not as many people have probably tried jerk pork. And if I had to choose between the two, I would say that jerk pork is my favorite. The reason being, like, chicken is something you eat all the time. But in this case, this is a leg of pork. I love it because the fattier nature of pork, you get a bit more flavor. It gives it like a really nice texture. The meat ends up being nice and moist, juicy, very flavorful, very tender, and it gives you a departure from chicken. So let's get into it. The picnic shoulder is the lower part of a pig's front leg, and these body parts that do work, in my opinion, tend to have more flavor. They might not be as tender as other cuts, but if you cook them properly, it'll be perfectly fine. You'll notice that it doesn't have like a lot of fat throughout the meat. It's really on the outside. And as with all meat, my first step is to wash it down with some vinegar, bit of water to submerge it, let it soak for a little while. And from there, we're ready to start seasoning. Very simple. Just a bit of adobo, which is seasoning salt. Use whatever brand you like. Some black pepper, paprika, blended seasoning, and I like Walker's Wood jerk seasoning, the hot and spicy kind. You can use whatever brand you like, though I will say if you don't really like spicy food, use one of the lower heat levels, like the mild. So you get all of that flavor, but with less of the heat. From here, the next step is really just getting the seasoning onto the meat, taking your time to really rub it all in. Because we're dealing with the hot and spicy jerk seasoning, I actually like to use gloves because although I'm going to wash my hands afterwards, even just the few minutes of mixing it in, just the heat from the seasoning, it can like irritate my skin. So in that case, I go ahead, I put on a pair of gloves and just really take my time to really rub all of that seasoning, work all of that seasoning into the meat. Generally, I would then cover this and put it into the fridge to marinate overnight at minimum. But if I'm like meal prepping, I'll buy the meat in advance, put it in the freezer, and let it defrost overnight when I'm ready to actually cook it. But the point is that you want to let it sit in this seasoning for a good amount of time so it can absorb the flavor. Now we are going to prepare to actually cook the jerk pork. I seasoned it when I first bought it, put it into the freezer until I was ready for it, which is generally what I do with meat. And now I've just defrosted it, it's all thawed out and whatnot, and time to get it into the oven. And all I'm going to do is just go ahead and put it into my pan. And just a regular roasting pan. If you wanted to, you could use your actual pan, but I'm being a little bit lazy. I don't feel like washing dishes. So I've just lined the pan with some aluminum foil, and our pork is going to go into this. Here I have the pork. You can see it's defrosted. There's some liquid at the bottom and whatnot. And all I'm going to do is, usually, like if I'm making this for a larger crowd, I would use like a whole butt or a whole shoulder. But because it's just for me, I'm meal prepping for the week, I got a half. So the downside to that is I think like the skin is some of like the best, is like the best part of the pork. The meat is good too, but like the skin makes a really big difference, which is why I haven't trimmed it off. But you don't have as much area, and in comparison to if you were using a larger shoulder or a larger pork butt. But this will do as well. What I'm gonna do though is I'm gonna make sure that I go ahead and stand it up. You want the skin to be up rather than down into the pan. The reason being that there's like a bit of fat underneath the skin. The skin itself has fat. As it cooks, that fat is going to render out. It's going to run down into the meat and help to keep it nice and moist and juicy. As well as I like the skin to be a little bit crisp if possible. Like it doesn't have to be like hard, like crackling, but just to kind of crisp it up a little bit, cook out a bit of the fat. And to get that, you're going to need to cook it with the skin up. I'm just going to actually put it to stand up rather than putting it on its side. Because if I was to take this and put it on its side, what would happen is all of that fat and the yummy goodness and whatnot from the skin would just run off into the pan, which wouldn't be the worst because then you could just baste it. But in this case, putting it with the skin up, Never mind that it's a more narrow cut of meat, it should help, to kind of self-baste the meat. And then as well, we'll check about halfway or so through and just give it like a nice little basting. And then as it gets closer towards being done, we'll take the cover off and, baste it as well so that it crisps up and browns really nicely. And all I'm doing here is just the little bit of seasonings that I had that dripped off is I'm just going to now take that and just pour it over the top. Like, it doesn't have to all stay on there. I'm not going to cake it on. But really just, like a nice thin layer of that. The rest of it can run off onto the side. But what I'm going to do is actually going to be just to add a little bit of liquid. So this way we ensure, I haven't greased the bottom of the baking pan. So I want to ensure that while this is cooking, before it gets up to temperature and it starts rendering out fat, that you have some moisture so that the seasoning doesn't burn and so that the meat as well doesn't burn. You can certainly just add a little bit of water. You have more than enough seasoning and whatnot going on here where you should end up with a pretty flavorful gravy. But if you wanted, you could add a little bit of stock, a little bit of broth, or even a little bit of wine or something like that. I wouldn't really recommend anything overly sweet or anything with too strong of a flavor, right? We want the pork to come through. And then if you choose to use broth or stock, try to use something with a little bit less sodium so that you don't end up with the meat being overly salty or the gravy being overly salty. Because bear in mind that we've already seasoned this. It has salt in it already. So we don't want to go ahead and add a ton more salt to it through the gravy. All I have is just a ramekin with just a little bit of water. And to this, I'm going to add just a bit of unsalted chicken broth. And a little bit of some ginger stone wine. Not much to give it too much flavor, just enough to make it where when you eat it, you should go, what's that? And it's the ginger stone wine. Give it a little jiggle. And this I'm now going to pour into the bottom of our pan. Just give it a little jiggle. Just so it mixes in with the seasoning and everything. And this I'm now going to cover with some foil. But here's a little tip. I want the skin to not get all torn up and pull away when I take the foil off later on. So I just have a little bit of oil here, and I'm just gonna actually grease the foil that's gonna touch the pork, so that way when it comes into contact with the skin, it shouldn't stick. Because I want to make sure I'm able to tense the pork. I've got 2 pieces, but I really only need to oil the piece that's going to come into contact with the pork. This is now going to go into the oven. I've got the oven going at 350 degrees. The reason being that I don't want to start out with a high temperature, right? I want to start out with it being a bit lower because I want the meat to be moist, tender. I'd rather cook it at a lower temperature for a longer amount of time to have it be nice and tender when it's done. But when it's nearing the time to be finished, I'll take the foil off. I'll up the temperature a bit so it can get some nice color. So the skin as well can crisp up a bit to help it render out a bit more fat. But I don't want to start out with a super high temperature because we're not trying to sear the meat or anything like that. We want to let it just cook nice and slow. So our end product is tender, moist, juicy. All right, 350 degrees into the oven. Our pork has been cooking for about an hour now, and I'm going to go ahead and just open it up just so I can see what we're working with here. And I'm just going to be gentle because unfortunately the foil is sticking a bit. Take your time, and there we go. Foil comes off. Alright, so we're looking like we're a good way towards being there. I am just going to check for temperature to see how close we are to being done. Let's cook it until the juices run clear. So we're not quite there as yet. Thermometer isn't working, so next best thing. So we'll go ahead and just cover this back up. put it back into the oven. Alright, so it's now been about a half hour or so, and I am going to check the pork once again. So, like the part further out is kind of cooked through, but if you look here, you can see like closer towards the bone, you're still getting a bit of red. So, back into the oven, just going to let it keep going. But as you can see, like the skin, quite a bit of the fat from underneath the skin is rendered out, like maybe another 20 minutes or so. Back into the oven, still at 350, and just letting it do its thing, but just checking along the way, because I want it to be done, but I don't want it to be like overcooked. Alright, so it's now 20 minutes later, and checking the pork again. You see close to the bone that it's now running clear, whereas before it was, you were seeing a little bit of red. Alright, so now we can say that our pork is done. Just about 2 hours at 350. It's pretty much done. You could certainly stop at this point, but I just want to brown the skin a little bit more. Just bear in mind that because of the fat, like the little fat cap underneath the skin, you're not really going to be able to get this super crispy, right? We would have needed to score this, but I don't want it to be all, torn up looking and whatnot. I want to leave it kind of whole. So I'm just going to leave it like this, but I'm just going to baste it a little bit with some of the gravy. And with that, we should actually get more color. That's more my aim than for it to be, thin and crispy like crackling. What I've done is I've taken the oven off of bake and switched it over to broil. So, that's like the boiling mechanism on the top. And with this, I've just lowered the rack in the oven and turned it to the low setting for broil. So that way it'll brown, but I don't want it to burn. And at this point, it's really important, should you choose to take this step, because you could certainly stop here, to just make sure you keep a close eye on it. So just back into the oven for a few minutes, and we're pretty much done from there. When we take it out of the oven, we'll just let it sit for a bit and rest. Alright. And so now then, here we have our finished jerk pork. As you can see here, I've had the skin brown just a little bit, and like I said, it wouldn't crisp up exactly, but it's got like some nice color to it. I just went ahead and I cut a little piece of it off. It's nice and tender, nice and moist. Falls apart. You taste it. It's like it's got a little bit of kick, but it's not overly hot. Yeah, it's hot, but not overly so. Just the right amount of salt, just the right amount of spices. It's nice and juicy, tender. That's the business right there.
Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my cooking at home playlist. Go ahead and click that thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.